Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. And it's titled, Are You Already Separated and Don't Know It? So you're joining me in the AP Lawyers Legal Zone, and I hope we can have an informative webinar today discussing this also important topic. And I would let you know why it's so important, and if you have that dispute going on, some ways that you may be able to resolve it yourself. So most people feel they need to be physically separated first to actually qualify as separated, or to be able, they feel they need to be living in separate homes if they're going to claim that they're separated. Well, as you would see by the time we're done this webinar, that's just one factor in deciding whether or not you're separated. For those, by way of introduction, my name is Angela Princewell. For those of you who don't know me, I'm very passionate about family law. I run a firm of fantastic lawyers and support staff, and we truly feel that every day we make people's family lives better, and that's our mission. And we've won many awards for this, and we continue to, because it's important to us to put our clients first and aim to make their family lives better. We have wealth of information both on our online blogs and our YouTube channels. And the goal of this is to inform you and educate you and help you resolve your disputes as amicably as possible. And if you do need our help, we're always here with extended hours. Now during social distancing, being able to work through multiple channels remotely to bring solutions to you. So back to your legal separation. This is very important right now, especially with people having to remain home most of the time during the lockdown. And we recognize that that's put a strain on some relationships, and some relationships are actually ended, but the parties don't feel that they're separated because due to government lockdown measures, people are still having to remain in the same home. And then even in the past, I've had people say things to me like, we've been separated for the last year, but we don't have a legal separation, or we've not been a couple for a while, but we're not legally separated. It's almost this suggestion that there is some sort of legal documentation that needs to be exchanged to confirm that the parties have separated. So I can put you to rest on that issue by letting you know that that is not necessary. You can be separated in Ontario and live in the same house, and you don't need a document, to the other, exchange any form of document, or even write to the other side letting them know that you're separated. So in Ontario, under Ontario law, parties are separated when the relationship has broken down and there is no reasonable prospect that you would reconcile. So to put it in another way, and this is actually taking the words of a judge, when was it that the parties knew or acting reasonably ought to have known that their relationship was over and would not resume? So reasonably is the word, because I understand that, one person may think the relationship is over and the other person doesn't. But when would you, as a reasonable person, so it's the test there is reasonable. So if you're a reasonable person, when would be that point in time that the parties would believe that this relationship was over and was not going to resume? So when you put it so simply, you see that parties can live under the same roof and still be separate and apart. But what happens when one party knows that there will be no reconciliation, but the other party still hopes that the relationship would resume? Obviously, you could see where that would be a conflict, especially if the parties are still in the same place. Or even in some cases, I've encountered situations where one party moves out, maybe to go stay with a parent or a friend, and the other that is thinking, well, we're just going through a temporary break. This has happened, and this person is likely to come back. They're not thinking, well, this is it. This is the date of separation. So there's, so I can see where that conflict would arise. So where that happens, how will the courts deal with this? Well, by reviewing the circumstances of each couple's case, the courts recognize that everybody's relationship has its own, unique set, its own unique characteristics. And in determining your date of separation, if there's a conflict, I'm going to go through 10 lists here. This is not an exhaustive list. It's just some of the things that a court would look at if having to decide the date of separation issue. So the first one is, are the parties sleeping in separate bedrooms? Well, I mean, that speaks for itself. If you're in separate bedrooms, how long, and things like that kind of would flow out of that. Was it just a one-night thing and then you're back in the bedroom, or are you living in the same home, but there's now this pattern of just sort of trying to maintain a physical space in the home? Some people move to the basement. And it could even just be as simple as one person sleeping on the couch for most of the time and maybe just going to use, make use of the master bedroom once in a while, but maybe just sleeping on the couch. That's maintaining separate bedrooms. And for as long as that's been going on, even though you're in the same house, you would still be considered separated. Is there an absence of sexual relations? So I want to pause here too and say this is a factor, not a determinative factor. So the fact that there's been no sexual relationship between the parties is a factor in deciding that they've been separated. However, the fact that there is the presence of sexual relations doesn't mean that the parties aren't separated. So these are all factors, and neither one's, there's no one factor that if that exists, then that's it, it's settled, it's the date of separation. No, the courts would look at this against the background of your specific relationship, as well as how many of these factors exist at the time. So are the parties sleeping in separate bedrooms? Is there an absence of sexual relations? Did the parties communicate, discuss family problems as a couple? Did the couple attend social activities together and present themselves to others as a couple? Did the parties continue to cook and perform household tasks as they did before the alleged date of separation? How did the parties manage their finances? Who managed them? Is it, still happening in exactly the same way as things happened before separation? How are car payments, for example, being made? Cell phones, other home accounts. How are these being paid? Is there, a joint account that's still being maintained, or have the parties sort of separated their finances, but maybe just for convenience sake still maintain that joint account to be able to pay for these resources? And again, it's fine if, the parties, for practical reasons, disagree to maintain their finances. But again, it's one factor that the courts would consider. Did we just, was life going on just as normal, or was there this conscious decision that we will manage our finances together until we reach an agreement or something to have everything separated? So anyhow, how your finances are managed is a factor in determining your date of separation. Was there an incident that stands out, a seminal event? Could it be a physical altercation, for example, a major blow-up argument? Is there sort of infidelity that was discovered on a particular day? So was there a seminal event following which, one could say reasonably after that date, the parties never reconciled? Has one party stopped depositing money into a joint account? For example, has the party or has either party transferred funds out of a joint account? That happens often when parties are separating. One party would transfer funds out of the joint account, maybe looking out for themselves or trying to prevent the other party from being able to access those funds. So if that's happened, then that's, one factor in determining the date of separation. And how did the parties file their taxes? So are taxes still filed by both parties as married? or as one person filing as separated. Again, remembering that these are not determinative factors. Sometimes people may choose to file their taxes because of the tax benefits that come with filing one way or another, but this would be an important consideration in determining your date of separation. And the last on my list of 10 factors is, did either party retain or consult a lawyer? So clearly, if you've retained a lawyer to get the process started, then that's, and you're using that date as the date of separation, it's kind of hard to contest that. Consulting a lawyer could also be tricky in the sense that a lot of times people consult with a lawyer just because they've had an argument, or they're just thinking about what their rights and responsibilities are if they separate. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're now separated without the possibility of reconciliation, because people do reconcile a lot of times after speaking to us. But that's one of the factors that will be considered in deciding your date of separation. So I know I went over that list sort of quickly, and I did interrupt myself a lot in between the lists to explain, but I thought it was important that you kind of understand those lists. I would make sure that I have this list up on our website under the blog section, so that you can see sort of the factors, and you can have this as a handy list for yourself in, if you're having an issue figuring out what your date of separation is. Okay, so the courts, when trying to decide this date of separation issue, are usually very careful to differentiate between parties living together in an unhappy or stormy relationship versus two separate individuals who are under the same roof. Now, I'm just going to pause there for a minute because I see a raised hand, so give me 1 second. Let me see. Okay, hello, Marisol. Hello. Okay, I see your raised hand, Marisol. If you want to type a question, I will be able to. I'll be able to get to that as when I get to the question section. I actually saw you raise your hand, and I thought that might be there might be something that you wanted to bring my attention to right away. So, okay, so I will just go back. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out the tech here and make sure that you can hear me properly. So just give me 1 sec here. Okay. All right. Okay. So yeah, I was just talking about when the courts are looking at deciding the date of separation, where there's a dispute, the courts have to differentiate, and they're mindful of the difference between a stormy or unhappy relationship, that it's just one where the parties have just had this up and down relationship, a very stormy sort of relationship, versus one where it's two people living separate and apart in the same home. And this is not an easy thing to do, but I'm sure even in your lives and with your friends, you might have observed relationships where the people have been together for years. There's really no intention to separate, but for the last but for however long you've known them, they've had this very explosive sort of stormy relationship, or some people have just been very unhappy, some for pretty much most of the relationship. And the courts try to make sure that they differentiate that from a situation where people are living separate and apart in the home, and it's not a perfect science, and they just try to go through those factors that I went over with you earlier, to see if the parties really are separated, or just to come to that date of separation as perfect or imperfect as it may be. So why is the date of separation so important? That mini trials are being held just on this one issue. Why is it so important? Well, the two main reasons: one, your date of separation is your valuation date. And the valuation date is the date your assets and liabilities are valued for the purposes of equalization. And the second reason why your date of separation is important is because that's when your 1 year begins to count for purposes of getting a divorce. If you're just going on the grounds that you've been separate and apart for a year and there's no reasonable prospect of reconciliation. So your valuation date is where I'm really going to focus on now, because if you get your valuation date wrong, it could cost you a lot of dollars in equalization payments. So that's why it's important to give some thought to the date of separation. And in some cases, as we would find later, that it really doesn't matter. There's not a lot riding on it, and in some cases there is. So that's where you would have to use your judgment. And if you're not sure, we suggest strongly that you either speak to us or you speak to any other experienced family law lawyers that you're comfortable working with. So while that, getting a divorce, for people who want to get the divorce very quickly, it's exciting to agree to, an earlier date of separation. So you have the 1 year, period of separation over and done with, and you can now move on with getting your divorce. You want to be mindful of retroactive child support and spousal support obligations. You want to be very mindful of that, because those start to count from your date of separation. So be very mindful. Any agreement you reach, if it's not the actual date that you believe, because it's it all depends on whose perspective it is, and if you're not litigating or trying to mediate that issue, and you just want to agree to a date, just put some thought to it. And if you have a support obligation, you want to be clear that either you agree that there's not going to be any retroactive support obligation, or just make sure that, or maybe it's not even in your best interest to do that because of the amounts that you may be owing if child and spousal support are looked at retroactively. So obviously, the easiest way with the date of separation is to agree. You have the list, or you're going to have the full list on our website. If you're in a relationship where you're able to safely communicate with the other party and you guys are disputing the date of separation, well, you both can probably use that list as a guide to help you come up with a date. Because the less things that you have to argue about, the quicker, more inexpensively and amicably maintaining any goodwill that you can when the relationship is over. But so if you don't agree, that would be my first suggestion, is to try to go through those factors and be reasonable and see what date can be agreed to. If you still cannot, or if the facts are just so disputed, if your recollection of events or the way you both see things is just so far apart and there's no way to close the gap by yourselves, then maybe, try mediation with a knowledgeable mediator. Of course, you want a mediator that understands the consequences of setting that date of separation, and realizing that from a family law context, the date of separation is not simply a date. There's a lot of obligations riding on that date. And then the other question you may want to ask yourself is it really worth it? Because sometimes this dispute as to the date of separation is not even worth it. The difference in dates could be so close that nothing turns on it. So if So today's the 19th, for example. If one person is insisting the date of separation is the 15th and the 19th, in most cases, and I use the underlying word most because, you know, a lot can happen in 4 days, but in most cases, a lot doesn't ride on that 4-day difference. You know, it may mean having to wait an extra 4 days to file your divorce application. But other than that, like, it's really not a lot that's going to ride on it. There's really not, it's not something that it's something the other side probably shouldn't be looking at support for 4 days. So you don't have that issue dealing with that. And, you know, if you're caught up in a court battle trying to decide between, you know, the 15th versus the 19th, then you may end up even delaying the divorce and it becomes counterproductive. Now, the caveat there is obviously if within those 4 days, somebody has, you know, someone's stock prices, for example, has absolutely gone off the roof and they've made a few $1 million, then now those extra 4 days mean a lot. Now, it may not even be millions, but it could be it could be anything. At the end of the day, when you're negotiating your family law matter, you want to make sure that you get, you know, a fair deal that's, you know, supported under the law. So you know, we don't take we don't take things for granted. The whole idea is we're not trying to have you leave things on the table except you choose to. So if in those 4 days it looks like there might be something that is worth investigating, then fine. But more often, as I said, and more often than not a lot's riding on it, except the principle of it. And I know that there's a lot to be said for the principle, the truth of it. If you're, you know, if you know, without a shadow of doubt that your date of separation was the 15th, and somebody, you know, the other party's arguing that it's the 19th, then, I mean, I can get how from, you know, a principled standpoint, you don't want to be part of a lie, and you want to make sure that, you know, this is one more lie that that partner may have been telling, and you just don't want them to get away with it. I understand that and I respect it, but you have to make an informed decision of whether the cost of getting to the truth is really worth the benefit. And only you can really know that answer. You know, as objective third parties advising you, we would probably say if it's just from the principal standpoint and not a lot is riding on it, maybe it's one of those issues that you can concede, but only you know how important that is to you. And if the principle of it, and if it's important that you get to, you know, that the truth is said exactly how it happened, then obviously it's worth pursuing. Again, going over those factors that we've talked about earlier, which is what a judge would use when deciding your date of separation for you. What we've also done in situations in the past, and this is what the family law bar and judges suggest doing, where there's this nagging conflict on the date of separation, and the parties just can't get past it, and they're not even sure if, you know, it's worth pursuing, then the best thing to do is just create 2 financial statements. So remember, with the first reason why your date of separation is important is because it's the valuation date. So it's the date all of your assets and liabilities are valued, so that we can determine what date, what the net family property is for both of you, and we can see who gets paid what amount. So if you're saying, you know, we separated on the 1st of January 2020 because that's absolutely the day, you know, one party moved out of the bedroom, and the other is saying, well, it has to be, you know, May 1st because that's the day I moved out of the house. Before things get crazy and a lot of dollars get spent, and people, you know, all the goodwill that you may have get lost just trying to deal with this issue that may or may not have anything riding on it, really, the best thing may be to do 2 financial statements. It would cost you a little more, clearly, in terms of investment of your time and resources if you're having a lawyer do it for you, but it would save you a lot of argument down the road. It's the easiest and fastest way to put the issue to rest. Because sometimes when we can show on paper that there's really no difference in the parties' position regarding their net family properties, if we use one date of separation, one way or the other, then a lot of times the issue just gets resolved there and the parties are able to move on. So that's something that you may want to try if you're trying to resolve your disputes yourself and the date of separation is a nagging issue. Use both dates, do financial statements with both dates, and then depending on what those numbers uncover, then you can decide how you want to proceed with dealing with the issue going forward. So that's my last tip for you for dealing with this. And we had received some questions, so I'm going to go over those very quickly because I want to keep my time with you today under 30 minutes. So the first question is, what happens when we cannot agree on a date of separation? Well, if you're unable to agree on the date of separation, you would have to figure out how you want to resolve the dispute. So you're either going to try mediation, arbitration, or you're going to end up in the courts. If you end up in court, I already gave you a list of the factors that, recur in all of the cases, and that's what the courts kind of go over each and every time they have to deal with this situation in deciding what your date of separation is. How do the courts decide who is correct on the date of separation? What kind of evidence is needed? So again, go back to that original list, were you sleeping in separate bedrooms? Has there been an absence of sexual relations? How, what kind of communications did you have even though you were living in the same home, those separate and apart? So all of those factors that I had gone over earlier, but in terms of evidence, obviously some of them are easier to have to provide evidence, right? So I know one of the items on the list was, say, a physical altercation. So that seminal event that was just the day that it was over for sure. If there was a physical altercation and the police were called in, well, you want to bring in, did you file a police report? If you could bring that in, then obviously that's the kind of evidence a judge would like to see. If you opened a new account, for example, that's something you could show to the judge to say, well, after May 19th, I raced to the bank, I opened my own sole account because I wanted to sort of begin to maintain that separation in our finances. If your partner, took out money from a joint line of credit, for example, you could say, well, it was after the date of separation. You could provide statements showing, well, this was never done before. We had this argument, things escalated, and she withdrew, XYZ amount of money from the bank accounts. And that's evidence that, we separated as of that date, and she was just beginning to act in her own self-interest and not, trying to still keep the family unit together. So everything depends on your situation, but as I said, some of it would just be your word. And if this is going to a trial or an arbitration, the judge would be looking at demeanor. They would be judging your credibility, the quality of your evidence, and just of your voice and your mannerism and the way you present your evidence, in addition to whatever documentary proof that you can provide. But hopefully, you're not going to be going to a trial on the date of separation issue, because you're going to try to use a lot of the factors that I've talked to you about in resolving your issues. There's another question. Will I have to pay support from the date of separation even if I don't agree to that date? Yeah, that's a tricky one, and that's where it might be, in your best interest to really resolve this date of separation issue to the date that you've picked. Because yes, depending on the circumstances, so I don't want to make it sound like it's automatic, But more often than not, if you have a support obligation, it would usually start from the date of separation. So if someone's asking you now to pay support retroactive to a year ago when you were under the impression that you're still a couple, they're just blowing off some steam by staying over at a friend's, and now you find that you have accrued thousands of dollars in support obligation, that's yeah, that's something that could be an issue. So that's where you want to be very careful and put a lot of thought to, you know, the date of separation. That's one of the cases where I'll say a lot is riding on the date of separation. So the short answer to that question is, even if you don't agree to that date, if a judge or an arbitrator finds that that is your date of separation, and there is support obligations, yes, you may find yourself having to pay support retroactive to that date. And this is where negotiations can come in very handy, right? Because if you may, you know, rather than just litigating all the way, you may be able to cut a deal with the other party. And, you know, because of the time and resources you could both save, well, maybe meet midpoint on your date of separation, or even maybe agree to their date of separation, but agree that, you know, your support doesn't start at that point, and maybe it starts at a later point. That's where negotiating skills come up. It may not, the answer may not just be in insisting or in refusing to agree to a date of separation the other party is insisting on. The answer may lie in negotiating the consequences surrounding that date of separation, and sometimes that's a better strategy rather than just, you know, fighting a losing battle. And what if my spouse's separation date differs from mine, and the value of his assets on that date are also lower than on my date? Is this considered intentional? I mean, I can see how from your angle, so that question, I think I should rephrase that. So that the question is really speaking to, you know, the one spouse making their net family property, or one person's date of separation produces net family property that's lower than another person's. So what that would mean then is, you know, they get to pay, if you go with the other date of separation, and that party gets to benefit from paying a lower amount in equalization. And, you know, the person is wondering, well, is this considered intentional? I don't know. Well, we can never know. Obviously, I can see how it would appear to be intentional, and the party not wanting to pay, you know, any more in equalization than they have to. But it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, what do the facts of your case show, and also what, you know, what's a way to settle the issue so that it doesn't, the benefit doesn't outweigh, or the cost doesn't outweigh the benefits, I should say. Okay, so I see a couple of questions here. Give me 1 second. Okay, so the first question is asking me to elaborate more on living parallel versus unhappy marriage. Yeah, that's a difficult one. So let's say if that's your situation, and you know, that's your evidence that we're not separated, we're living, I mean, we are separated, we're not just living unhappy marriages, and then you had to testify to this, or even in presenting your materials to a mediator, here's some of the evidence that hypothetically could be the case. So you could say, you know, we've had a very, you know, peaceful relationship. We took walks together every evening. We, you know, we attended all parent-teacher meetings together, and you know, went on field trips together with the children. We took vacations as a family. And now it could be in the last 1 year, we haven't attended any events together as a family. You know, we live in the same house, but I don't do his cooking. He you know, we pretty much just live as roommates. I cook for myself and the children, and he does his thing. We alternate, you know, attending at school events, or he does all of the parent-teacher interviews. I attend all the field events. We don't go anywhere together. There's been no sexual relations whatsoever. And, you know, he's pretty much, I sleep in the kids' room and I pretty much just leave him to sleep in the master bedroom. So that's living parallel lives, just separate apart in the same home. The other party that might be arguing, well, we've just always had an unhappy marriage, it's always been that way, but we weren't separated. Part of what their evidence may be would be, well, we always fought a lot. She's moved out a few times in the last 5 years of our marriage. She's moved out to her parents at least, you know, 4 out of 4 to 5 times, 5 in the last 5 years. This time was no different. She moved away, she came back, and when she returned, you know, it was the same. You know, that party can say, well, yes, we weren't happy. We've always slept in separate bedrooms, but we never meant to end the marriage. We just always wanted to keep it this way for the children. And we've never talked about breaking up. We sleep in separate bedrooms just to keep the peace, but we still go everywhere as a couple. And, you know, we still have sexual relations and we still cook the way we used to. We did everything we used to do, even though we weren't happy. We haven't been happy for years, but we were not separated. So I hope that sheds a little bit more of some light on living separate and apart versus married. It's a fact-driven exercise. It's not one and done. It's not scientific. Everyone's situation would be different. But just think about it in a day-to-day life of people. Some people who are in a relationship, they're not trying to break up by any stretch of the imagination. For whatever reason, they've decided to accept their lives and live that way. And then there's other people that are just done with that person and are only living in the house, just maybe because of children, maybe because of convenience, but they know the relationship is done. And they just, you know, a lot of times people tell me things like, we were in the house just as roommates. So are you living as just roommates in a home, or was this just part of the cycle of an up and down, you know, crazy relationship dynamic that the parties had going? Okay. So this is, how do you determine cash income for a self-employed person when the cash income portion is upward of $200,000? Income tax return shows total income of under $50,000. Okay, so while this is outside the scope of today's webinar, because I just wanted to talk about figuring out what your date of separation is. But I think it's a very important question, and thanks for asking that, because I understand that it's a concern for a lot of people, hiding incomes and things like that. Whether or not the date of separation has anything to do with it, cash income is always very problematic for self-employed persons. There's a number of ways to deal with this. Again, none of it is perfect. It's another fact-driven exercise, as a lot of things are in family law, and it's about how you put together your evidence and just try to show to an objective third party what's going on. So in this case, if the cash income, it depends. I'm not sure what business the self-employed person is doing, but if they're getting a lot of cash income, well, maybe the lifestyle. So that's one way you can show that the income the person is earning. If a person's earning $50,000, the lifestyle would be different. Well, in most cases, might be different from when they're earning $200,000. So you may be able to put together the family's expenses, and you can show that to the judge or mediator, saying it's not possible for, Mr. X to have been making $50,000 a year when our expenses as a family exceeded $150,000. Also, the courts also recognize that some jobs are easier to make cash income, and you don't have to I mean, I don't want to sound flippant, but in some cases, you don't have to try too hard to convince a judge that certain occupations receive a lot of their incomes in cash. And I don't want to name names here, but there's some occupations that, you know, the judges don't have a hard time just recognizing that if they're doing this job, we know what's on your income tax returns isn't a true reflection of your income, and there's a lot of cash that's happening. And so what would happen in that case is income would get imputed to that person to bump up their income to the proper amount. So there is one, proof of lifestyle, the nature of self-employment that the person is engaged in, and then you know, asking for disclosure of the business. So in some cases, while they might have cash income, they may be required to give receipts. So maybe if we could get, you know, receipts and things like that the business has, we may be able to see the cash income. In some cases as well, income has fluctuated over the years. So maybe in anticipation of a separation, one party begins to receive more of their income as cash so that they can underreport their income and reduce their support obligations. Well, we can ask, when we do that sort of comparison, if there's no reasonable explanation for why the income, the huge income drop, then it's safe to assume that something you know, fishy is going on, and maybe income can be imputed to them to make up for that differential. So I hope that answers your question as well there, Amanda. And I'll just quickly round up the last couple of questions that we have here. And Amanda, I believe we have, if you check out our YouTube channel, we have a couple of videos, I think, touching on the income, on a party's income, that might be more informative in case I didn't get to the heart of your question. And then the other one is, if we separate it on and off, do we pick the last date we separated? Well, the short answer to that is yes. You have to pick the last date, because I guess all the other times you did kind of reconcile, so it doesn't count anymore. You pick the last date. And then if you live together in the same home, do you still separate? That's exactly the reason why I'm holding this webinar, to let you know that it doesn't matter that you're living together. It doesn't matter that you don't have any documents signed. You can be separate and apart in the same home. It really just depends on what your intentions were. And the other party's intention, yes, it counts, but it has to be reasonable intentions. If it's clear to a reasonable person that this relationship is past reconciliation, even though you're living in the same home, you are still separated. And then why, the last question is, why is the date of separation important in a legal separation process? As I said, your divorce is counting on that date, but most importantly, your valuation of your assets and the amounts that you can get to, you may have to pay to the other person, or the amount that you receive in equalization is riding on that date of separation. And if you get it wrong, you may lose out on thousands and thousands of dollars in settlement that you may ordinarily be entitled to. So I hope this helps. I'm going to wrap up here. If you have any further questions, feel free to send them in to us. Every month, we try to go through, you know, different themes and subjects that we have or that we hear about, inquiries and things like that, and we try to put it together as a webinar so that we can provide as much detail and information to you that we can. So that's why we've decided to bring this to you, so you know that being stuck in the home with your partner at this time doesn't change the fact that you're separated, because we recognize that you may just be living in the home just out of convenience because of the all of the lockdown measures going on. So it's been a pleasure speaking with you today. Please check out our YouTube channel, subscribe to us. We would have this recording on our YouTube channel within the next couple of days, so that if there's anything you missed and you want to go back and refresh your memory, you would have it on there. And yeah, we look forward to you joining us again in the future as we discuss other legal issues that you know, that we all have for every once in a while. So take care and enjoy the rest of your day.